Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Ken Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. Tonight, I'm delighted to be introducing Dr. Valentina Bold and James Robertson, who are here to give a talk called The Shepherd and the Shearer, James Hogg and Walter Scott at 250. Valentina is internationally recognised for her work on James Hogg, Scottish literature and culture. Valentina's books include James Hogg, A Bard of Nature's Making, and Robert Burns' Merry Muses of Caledonia. After many years in academia, Valentina now works freelance. Over 2020 and into this year, she has been leading James Hogg's 250th birthday celebrations in partnership with the University of Stirling. Events have included a pre-lockdown symposium at the Library of Congress in Washington, an online birthday party in December with special guests from Ettrick and beyond, and now this handover event to this year's Scott 250th. James Robertson, as many of you will know, is an award-winning author, as well as a poet, editor, novelist, and publisher. He is an active and prolific writer, enjoying stints at Hugh McDermott's cottage, Brownsbank, and the first writer in residence at the Scottish Parliament. His novel, Joseph Knight, won the Salter Scottish Book of the Year Award in 2003, as well as the Scottish Arts Council Book of the Year Award. And in 2010, his Scottish epic, And the Lad Lay Still, won James a second Salter Society Award. And of course, in 2013, James took on the huge task of writing a story every day for a year, each story being exactly 365 words long. This is only a taste of a very impressive CV. I know we are in for a real treat this evening, but before handing over to Valentina and James, can I just say there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So get thinking and just type your questions into the Q&A function, and we will do our very best to get through as many as we can. But for now, I'm delighted to say over to you, Valentina and James.
Thank you very much, Kenny. We'd like to thank the National Library too for sponsoring this event, celebrating two great Scottish writers who were born less than a year apart and who also died within a few years of each other. James Hogg, the Ettrick Shepherd, was born in December 1770, and Walter Scott, the Shearer, was born in the August of 1771. So in a very real sense, we're at a liminal stage of their intersecting 250th anniversaries, and it's absolutely wonderful to have this chance to celebrate the joint legacy of these two writers who made such an enduring impact on Scottish and on world literature. Now, Hogg and Scott are best known nowadays as novelists. Hogg for his brilliant private memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner, and Scott for his hugely impressive set of Waverley novels. And we'll no doubt touch on these as the session progresses, and we're happy to answer questions on them later. But what we really want to do tonight is to discuss more widely Scott and Hogg's lives and times, what they had in common as writers and writers with their hearts in the Scottish borders, what sustained their friendship over many years and the occasional dispute, it has to be said, and what their legacy is for modern Scottish writers, including James Robertson and others. So we thought we would start off with how they met. And just to set the scene a little, James Hogg first met Walter Scott in the late summer of 1802, although he says it was in 1801. I think we'll discover pretty early on he's not always the most reliable of sources. So at the time they met, Scott was 31. He'd been Sheriff of Selkirkshire for 3 years, and he was really at the start of his literary career. He'd published a translation of Goethe, he'd published a translation of German poetry too, And most pertinently for what will follow tonight, he just published the first volume of his Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border, a collection of border ballads, and he was actively seeking ballads for the later volumes. Now, at this time, Hogg was also 31, a couple of months older than Scott, and he was a working sheep farmer in the Scottish borders. At this point, he was managing his elderly father's farm at Ettrick House, and he'd recently started publishing. His first poem had appeared in the Scots Magazine in 1794. There'd been a patriotic song after that, an article on sheep diseases as well, and he also published his first volume of poetry, Scottish Pastorals, in 1801. So at this point, I'm going to pass over to James to read Hogg's own description of that meeting, which he first published as an article in 1829, and then published again with revisions in his Anecdotes of Sir Walter Scott, which came out first in New York in 1834, and then in Glasgow a year later. So I'll pass over to you, James.
Thank you. Yes, so this is the way that Hogg records or remembers that the first time he met the Shirra, Walter Scott. One fine day in the summer of 1801, as I was busily engaged working in the field at Ettrick House, Wat Shiel came over to me and said that I would gang awa down to the Ramsay Clough as fast as my feet could carry me, for there were some gentlemen there who wanted to speak to me. What can be at the Ramsay Clough that want me? What? I couldn't say, for it wasn't me that they spark to in the by ganging, but I'm thinking it's the Shirra and some of his gang. I was rejoiced to hear this, for I had seen the first volumes of the Minstrelsy of the Border and had copied a number of old ballads from my mother's recital and sent them to the editor preparatory for a third volume. I accordingly went towards home to put on my Sunday clothes. But before reaching it, I met with the Shirra and Mr. William Laidlaw coming to visit me. They alighted and remained in our cottage for a space better than an hour, and my mother chanted the ballad of Auld Maitland to them, with which Mr. Scott was highly delighted. I remember he asked her if she thought it had ever been printed, and her answer was, "Oh, no, sir, it was never printed in the world, for my brothers and me learned it frae auld Andrew Moore, and he learned it in Bonnie May frae auld Bobby Maitland, that was housekeeper to the first Laird of Tushy Law." "Then that must be a very old story indeed, Margaret," said he. "Aye, it is an old story, but mair nor that. Except George Wharton and James Stewart, there was never ane of my songs printed till ye printed them yoursel, and ye hae spoilt them altogether. They were made for singing and no for reading, and they're neither recht spelt nor recht setting down." Tak you that, Mr. Scott," said Laidlaw. Mr. Scott answered with a hearty laugh and the recital of a verse, but I have forgot what it was, and my mother gave him a rap on the knee with her open hand and said, "It is true enough for all that." So it's such a great, lively sort of record of that, and a slightly mythologized record of it. But I love the fact that here's the big man, coming in to get this to meet Hogg and to meet his mother, particularly Margaret Laidlaw, as she was, and they don't give way to him. They treat him as an equal right from the very start, and I think that's an indication of how the rest of the relationship between Hogg and Scott is going to go.
I think so. It's interesting too, isn't it, that I don't know if it's interesting. It's interesting to me that Hogg's reflecting back on something that had happened 30 years earlier, and I can't help but wondering if what he's doing is projecting backwards the feelings he had at that point on the feelings he had as a young man. And I think it's very interesting the words that he puts in his mother's mouth as well, which say a lot about how Hogg felt about ballads and about family traditions, because he's really making his mother charge Scott with the grave offence of taking songs which were very important to his family and to his community and spoiling them. Mm-hmm. spoiling them by putting them in a book where they're going to be locked away and not sung.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? And I think that there's a sort of an interesting divergence there, because for Hogg and his mother and the people before him, you know, their ancestors and their neighbours and so on, these songs were absolutely part of their community and part of their culture. Whereas for Scott, you get a strong sense that he's coming in from the outside and he's fascinated by these songs. He loves them and he wants to know them, but he's coming in as a kind of collector, and he wants to take them away and put them in a sort of safe place. Whereas Hogg, I think, is more of a, he also wants people to know them and so on, but he's sharing them, whereas Scott is collecting them. I think that's maybe quite an interesting difference.
I think it is, and I wrote something earlier called Ballad Raids and Spoilt Songs, Collection as Colonisation, and I think actually the way that Scott approached ballads was as a coloniser. He wanted them to show what the Borders was about, or what he wanted people to think the Borders was about, where for Hogg, and you can see this in the manuscripts that he sent to Scott, they were really important, not just because they were artifacts and beautiful literary objects, but because they represented people that had gone before them, including his mother. And I think that's why he brings his mother into that equation, because his mother represents the people of Ettrick, and in a very direct way, obviously, as did his grandfather, from whom many of her songs came. So he's actually giving Scott a tremendous gift by sharing these family ballads with him. And it would seem that 30 years on, he felt that Scott hadn't paid them due respect, and in that way hadn't actually paid his mother due respect. So very different. Attitude.
I think that's right. And there's two other things that come out of that, which is fascinating. I think one is that when we think of the collections, the great collections of the ballads and other songs that were made in the 19th century by Scott and then by others subsequent to that, the people who do the collecting are all men, and it's easy to forget that a lot of these songs were kept going from generation, passed from one generation to the next by women, and I think there's maybe a sort of wee subtle criticism in there as well. The fact that that Hogg makes his mother so central to that story, there's a kind of little implication there that the real the passes on of that tradition, the women are also being sort of cut out of it. On the other hand, I think we also have to recognise that things were changing very fast in the Borders and in other places, and that if somebody like Scott hadn't come along and actually tried to gather some of these songs together, some of them might actually have been lost, just because they wouldn't have continued to have been sung, and they might, if they hadn't been written down, might have been lost altogether. But we don't know that, of course.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true, and I'm sure Hogg did respect that as well, or he wouldn't have given them to Scott in the first place. But I think the thing that marks them off in that first encounter is that for Hogg, this is about performance, and I think it's worth saying as well, because it's not always recognised, that when Hogg says that his mother is chanting, he doesn't mean that she's reciting. He's using it in the way it was used, the word in the way it was used in the 19th century, as in the French chanter. So he's saying that his mother is singing. Yeah. And so Hogg is saying that Scott is actually really privileged to have encountered his family and their traditions. And someone said to me during the Hogg 250th that it must have been a great privilege for Hogg to meet Scott. And I would say, on the contrary, it was a great privilege for Scott to meet Hogg, because Hogg was someone who could explain what ballads meant and what stories meant. And I'm not saying that Scott didn't get this on an intellectual level, but I think it was a very important meeting for both of them, not just for Hogg.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And I think also it's really important what you've just highlighted as well, that with the writing down and printing of these ballads, there was to some extent a separation of the words from the tunes, and that was, I think, another thing that Mrs. Hogg or Mrs. Laidlaw would have resented, the fact that the words and the tunes get separated out by the simple act of the songs being printed and then therefore read out. Because if folk don't know the tune, then they can't sing them. All they can do is recite them as if they were poems, which they're not, of course.
Exactly, and I think that Hogg learnt from that experience too. And when he came to make his major song collection of Jacobite songs, the Jacobite Relics, he made sure that he included the music. And I think he'd maybe learnt from Scott's, not mistake, but Scott's youthful enthusiasm for words in the minstrelsy. And I wondered too if I could maybe share another account of that meeting, which gives a slightly different perspective. Because it wasn't just Hogg and Scott, it was William Laidlaw, who was Scott's amanuensis during this period, helping him make connections with ballads. And he writes about that meeting too, from a slightly different perspective. So I'll just read that because it's quite short as well. He talks about how, in fact, they didn't meet as Hogg remembers it at Ramsey Clough. Coming to meet him, taking him back to Ettrick Hall, to Hogg's mother's house. But in fact, they'd met the night before at Laidlaw's cousins, the Brydens, and Hogg had brought along a manuscript with him, so he knew he was going to meet Scott in advance. And the way Laidlaw describes it, he says, "The qualities of Hogg came out every instant, and his unaffected simplicity and fearless frankness both surprised and charmed the Shire. They were both very good mimics, and each of them born and bred storytellers, and when Scott took to employ his dramatic talent, he soon found he had us all in his power, for every one of us possessed a quick sense of the ludicrous, and perhaps of humour of all kinds. I well recollect how the tears ran down the cheeks of my cousin George, and although Walter's laugh was more quiet, it was easy to see it came from his heart. And Hogg and I were unbounded laughers when the occasion was very good." I mentioned that Hogg was a good mimic, and when the Brydens and I requested him to bear a hand, like as if a song in his turn, and although we were amused as usual, we soon discovered that Hogg's subjects were too local, and perhaps likewise of too low a caste, and doubtless the best proof of our enjoyment of the evening was that Hogg never sung a song that blessed night, and it was between 2 and 3 o'clock when we went to sleep. That's a quite different sort of account of the sort of breathless fandom of Hogg's memory. And it suggests, Hogg had omitted or forgotten they'd met the night before. But it also has a bit more camaraderie to it, I think, than what Hogg himself wrote about it. I don't know if you agree, James.
Yeah, no, it is. It's fascinating to think that, as you said, the way that Hogg describes that first meeting, you would never have known that all of that you've just described took place the night before, and that they were obviously up very late as well. But I think that also points to something else really fascinating, which is that it seems to me there's a constant tension in the relationship between Hogg and Scott. And let's face it, they knew each other for a long, long time. They were actually good friends. They got on well, although as you say, there were a few fallings out and fights along the road. But the thing that I think comes through in this is that they're coming from different places and different starts in life in a way. It seems to me that Hogg is absolutely of Ettrick. He's of the borders. He's of the countryside, and he is really a peasant from that culture. Whereas Scott, for all he had family connections in the borders and had spent some of his childhood down Smailham and so on, he is absolutely a man of the city. He's from Edinburgh. He's a lawyer. He studied the law. He's a sheriff that comes down to Selkirkshire because he's got the post as the sheriff. But he also spends a lot of time at his other job as clerk to the Court of Session in Edinburgh. So there are two worlds there that they inhabit, and I think Hogg is very keen to get into the world of Edinburgh because he wants to be published. He wants to be a published author, and that's where you go. But on the other hand, Scott also wants to keep at least one foot very firmly in the borders, because that's where he gets, that's the source of so many of the stories and traditions that he will then incorporate into either his own poems or later into his own novels as well. So there's a sort of constant tension there.
It's a different perspective, isn't it? Because for Hogg, Edinburgh is the kind of exciting, exotic place, and in a sense for Scott, that's what the Borders are. He's got the family connections, of course, but it's more of a kind of creative space for him, I think, in the way that Edinburgh worked for Hogg. I mean, there's differences of perspectives too that suggest that maybe in some ways Hogg was well aware of that and saw Scott in some ways as a cultural tourist. And I was thinking about a passage there when you were talking in his anecdotes of Sir Walter Scott, where he talks about Abbotsford, and he makes it very clear that Abbotsford's original name was Clarty Hole, that Scott romanticised it basically. And for Scott, I think the Borders is that place of romance, childhood happiness, whereas for Hogg, it's real life, do you know, and it has to be told the way his parents told it to him, although he's creative and so forth as well, but it's a very personal space to him. And I think he sees Edinburgh, on the other hand, as a kind of place for romance, and also a place with a double edge. So if you think about Confessions, and I knew I would touch on it at some point, it's a place that has kind of murderous, riotous locations, as well as tennis matches, and is more other in the way that the Borders is slightly other to Hogg and to Scott. And I think it's very interesting when you touch on that, the way that both writers fit into these two worlds, because I mean, Hogg was very much vilified in Edinburgh. Sorry, I've just had an update request on my computer. I'm hoping it's not going to start to completely go ahead. But I mean, Hogg was very much pilloried in Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine as this kind of boozing buffoon, I think he's called at one point, in the Noctes Ambrosianae, someone who has ideas that are like bees floating up through the air. And that sort of caricature, which was very damaging to Hogg, it cost him financial advantage, a Royal Literary Society pension, quite possibly, meant that he did in some ways inhabit the same world as Scott, but he also inhabited quite a different world. I know Scott had financial pressures, but Hogg had them throughout his life.
Yes, I think that's right, and he's a kind of outsider trying to get into Edinburgh, into Edinburgh society, and there is a certain snobbishness about Edinburgh society, letting him in, but only letting him in so far. And you're right, of course. Hogg, I think, from quite an early age, modelled himself on Robert Burns and really believed that he was going to be the next Robert Burns. But he also had the same difficulties as Burns, in the sense that he had to make a living off the land as a farmer, mostly as a sheep farmer, but doing other things as well. And like Burns, he had great difficulty making that financially viable, and then had to kind of fall back on getting support from Scott and others at different times, either financial support or just support to help him to get his work into print so that he could make money from another source, because it was so difficult for him to make a living as a farmer. But there is a certain, not so much from Walter Scott himself, but certainly from some of the other people in Edinburgh, there is a sort of a social barrier erected to try and keep Hogg at a bit of a distance. And even Scott himself occasionally falls for this one. You know, he makes jokes about Hogg's surname and describes him as the boar of Ettrick, and talks about him kind of grunting into rooms and things. So that Scott is sometimes himself slightly culpable of taking the mickey out of Hogg. But it's also true, I think, that Hogg he knew he could play to the gallery as the sort of rustic bumpkin, if you like. He could play the clown as well, but sometimes he also resented being portrayed as a clown. And I suppose the person who is really at the heart of this tension again is John Gibson Lockett, who's Walter Scott's son-in-law, who again is a writer and is the sort of a link between the two men, and who is one of the people who writes caricatures of Hogg as the Ettrick Shepherd in the Noctes Ambrosianae that are published in Blackwoods, these little sketches of comic sketches that are printed in the Blackwoods magazine.
Well, there's that wonderful the sofa anecdote, isn't there? And I think we should maybe read the sofa anecdote out, because it says a lot. And I should also say that I was, you know, I think Scott was kind of sometimes uncomfortable with this as well, and he didn't like John Wilson, the leader of the Noctes Ambrosianae set.
Yeah.
He found him quite unpleasant. So it is interesting to see that kind of tension, as you say, and Lockhart is definitely epitomises that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is some years later that Lockhart, when Lockhart is writing his huge and amazing biography of Sir Walter Scott after Scott's death, he tells this story about one of the first times that Hogg comes to Edinburgh and is invited to Scott's house there in Castle Street. And this is I think this is in about 1803, so it's maybe a year or two after they first met down in the Borders. And this is how he describes the meeting. The next time that Hogg's business carried him to Edinburgh, he waited upon Scott, who invited him to dinner in Castle Street, in company with William Laidlaw. So again, Laidlaw is present on this occasion, who happened also to be in town, and some other admirers of the rustic genius. So you can see that's Lockhart putting in a little sly dig there almost immediately. When Hogg entered the drawing room, Mrs. Scott, being at the time in a delicate state of health, which I think means is code for she's pregnant, was reclining on a sofa. The shepherd, after being presented and making his best bow, forthwith took possession of another sofa placed opposite to hers and stretched himself thereupon at all his length. For, as he said afterwards, I thought I could never do wrong to copy the lady of the house. As his dress at this period was precisely that in which any ordinary herdsman attends cattle to the market, and as his hands, moreover, bore most legible marks of a recent sheep smearing, the lady of the house did not observe with perfect equanimity the novel usage to which her chintz was exposed. The shepherd, however, remarked nothing of all this, dined heartily and drank freely, and by jest, anecdote, and song afforded plentiful merriment to the more civilized part of the company. As the liquor operated, his familiarity increased and strengthened. From Mr. Scott, he advanced to Shirra, and thence to Scott, Walter, and Watty, until at supper he fairly convulsed the whole party by addressing Mrs. Scott as Charlotte. Clearly, that was not what you were supposed to do in an Edinburgh drawing room, but it's really fascinating that you know, the people who are gathered there think that this is hilarious, that he should call Mrs. Scott Charlotte. But it's interesting that a couple of years earlier, Walter Scott immediately called Mrs. Hogg Margaret, and nobody objected then. That was a reversal of situations. So there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that little passage from John Lockhart.
There really is, and I think it says more about Lockhart than it does about Hogg. And who knows if it ever happened? Do you know?
Yes.
He's there without washing his hands after he smeared sheep. Well, who knows? I mean, it's quite. When you read it out like that, it's quite like one of the stories in the Noctes Ambrosianae, isn't it? It's a kind of little riff on how peasant-like Hogg actually is.
Yes, and how he doesn't know how to behave when he's in polite society, and you just get a sense that this is, again, that's John Gibson Lockhart just putting Hogg in his place, and not surprisingly, Hogg resents that kind of treatment quite deeply, and you know, and quite understandably as well.
Absolutely. You wonder if how Scott actually felt about, if that happened, you wonder how Scott actually felt. And given the Laidlaw anecdote that you know we shared slightly earlier, one can imagine him maybe chuckling rather than being totally, utterly offended
Absolutely,
by feet up on the
absolutely.
sofa, calling his wife by her name.
Well, exactly. I mean, you know, that was her name. So why would he, I don't think Scott would necessarily have taken offence at that. And I think the other thing to remember about Walter Scott is that he loved nothing better than to get away from that kind of society and go and sort of be amongst ordinary folk and listen to their stories, and often, you know, take the stories, then reuse them in his own material later on. But no, I've got a strong sense that Scott would not actually be that bothered by that. And so, yes, and of course, when that passage appears, Scott is dead, and so he's got no say over whether that's an accurate record of what happened on that occasion. As you say, it's a bit difficult to think that Hogg hadn't actually washed his hands between the sheet smearing and getting into Edinburgh and going into the drawing room on Castle Street. But yeah, it's interesting. I think also that we tend to think of Hogg being always in the debt of Scott, because Scott helped him out a couple of times financially, and he also did things like he would round up people to subscribe to you know, one of Hogg's books, that kind of thing. But it's also the case, of course, that that Scott was very much in Hogg's debt, because Hogg had contributed quite a lot of certainly to the third volume of the Minstrelsy. He had actually contributed a great deal to that, and Hogg was, in a sense, one of Scott's connections and lifelines to the sort of rich traditional life of Scotland that he was trying to capture in so many of his poems and novels.
He was, and I think I'm a Hogg fan. I'll just have to come out clean on his side of the fence here. But I think, you know, I mean, Hogg thought that he'd nicked some stories from him as well. I mean, something like Old Mortality. Now, Hogg's Covenanting novel, The Brownie of Bod's Beck, which I'm preparing an edition of in the moment just now, so I'm quite into that just now, came out after Scott's Old Mortality, but there's some evidence that Hogg may have started writing The Brownie of Bod's Beck before Scott decided to write a Covenanting novel. And of course, Hogg had to change the name of the hero of that because Scott had used it in Old Mortality. And, you know, the snippets that we have of their conversations, but there's in Scott's journals and their letters. But given that they did spend quite a bit of time together, I think there was some two-way traffic there, do you know?
Oh, no question.
The Minstrelsy onwards.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that. And I think, again, but it's interesting how, again, you see in the way that those two writers treat the Covenanters. You know, they both write these novels. Old Mortality, I think, comes out in 1816. And Scott takes a particular position and portrays the Covenanters in a way that Hogg feels really misrepresents them. And I think, again, you can see that is not unconnected to the way that that the Hoggs think that Scott has perhaps slightly misrepresented the ballads by printing them, but also by tweaking them as well, because Scott's not averse to changing a line if he thinks he's got a better line, you know, than the original had.
I think that's very perceptive, and I think that again, it's the same phenomenon as the minstrelsy. Hogg is sharing stories which are very dear and very personal to him, some of which he nicked in Dumfriesshire, I think, from Alan Cunningham, but we won't talk about that just now. But the actual action of the Brownie of Bod's Beck is set within roughly a 5-mile radius. There's a little interlude to Edinburgh, but most of it is set within about 5 to 10 miles of where Hogg grew up, from where he was born at Ettrick Hall. And the main action of the novel is in two farms, Riskenhope and Chapelhope, which are opposite each other. And, you know, Hogg is actually writing about territory that really mattered to him. It was the areas that he'd walked as a shepherd or, you know, as a young man, and he knew the places intimately. Scott, and I'm being flippant because I do like Old Mortality. It's a cracking novel for many reasons. but it doesn't matter to him in the way that it mattered to Hogg, who was talking about stories that he'd heard from people. I mean, his grandfather was born a few, an insignificant period of time later than the Covenanters. And these were stories that were remembered locally and also remembered in the southwest of Scotland. And he really cared about. So for Scott to muck it up for aesthetic reasons really annoyed Hogg. It really did.
Yeah, not just for aesthetic reasons, of course. I mean, there's politics, there's cultural
Absolutely.
politics, and other politics at play in this as well. And I think it reminds us that, the period that we're talking about, the early the first 2-3 decades of the 19th century, you have Walter Scott, you have John Gibson Lockett, you've got Francis Jeffrey and his team editing and producing the Edinburgh Review. And then you've got Scott and his gang, to use that phrase that was used earlier, starting up the Quarterly Review as a sort of Tory alternative to the more liberal Edinburgh Review. There's a lot of politics going on there. It's not actually it's the politics of reform versus conservatism, and the Covenanters weirdly come into that because their historical legacy, people are fighting over that. What does it mean? Does it have any relevance anymore? And can you trace the history of political change and reform back to the Covenanters, or do you go back on the other side? And you've got Walter Scott obviously writing a great deal about Jacobitism in his fiction, as does Hogg. So it's a period when poetry and fiction are absolutely focused on history, and Scottish history in particular, but that is not irrelevant to the politics of the day. And that, I think, is really fascinating. And it's also, of course, worth remembering that both Scott and Hogg would have been on with Tories, in the sense of that word meant in those days. They were Tories as opposed to Whigs. But that didn't mean that they were. That's not to translate into what we might now think of in modern terms as Tories. It's quite complicated. But I think politics is bubbling away under the surface of a lot of this as well.
Absolutely, and I think we could talk about that for a lot longer. But we probably should enter the twilight of our conversation at this point, because it would be good to leave some time for questions. And there's a couple of things we'd like to do at the end, I know. But it's interesting to think, isn't it? I mean, we're 250 years on. And just thinking about their reputations and their legacies. I mean, Hogg has been very much recognised by the Academy, and we think of people who championed his work like Douglas Mack, Gillian Hughes, Robin McLaughlin, Elaine Petrie, and their work basically laid the foundations and continued through the Stirling University Press, Stirling University, Edinburgh University Press, South Carolina, joint edition of the collected works of James Hogg. And that really opened the door, didn't it, to a discovery of Hogg's work in a wider sense.
Yes, it absolutely did. And I mean, to be honest, until I started to see all these volumes coming out in that new, complete edition of his work, I had no idea whatsoever of how prolific Hogg was. I mean, I knew he'd written a lot of poems and so on, but I can't remember how many volumes there are going to be eventually in it, but it's a very, very big edition and you realize how, like Scott and like other contemporary writers of that time, these people didn't hang about. They wrote voluminously and daily, and they churned out a lot of work, much of it of high quality. And you're right that we would have actually, a lot of what Hogg wrote has been lost in the interim, and it's great that we're now able to get it back and have another look at it. And I think you're right, his reputation has grown in the last half a century or so, partly because of that spade work that was done, several decades ago now by people like Douglas Mack at Stirling University. There's another interesting side to it as well, though, which is there's a descendant or indirect descendant of James Hoggs, whose name has just escaped me, but it's Bruce Gilkyson, and Bruce is from New Zealand, and he discovered Hogg and decided that he would a few years ago that he would retrace some of James Hogg's travels through Scotland, and wrote a very charming, not a particularly academic book, but a wonderfully charming book in which you really felt that he had got to know his ancestor from a couple of hundred years ago just by walking in his footsteps. And I love the idea that Hogg is available to us both through the academic corpus, but also he kind of comes off the page again as just being a really down-to-earth person that actually, if you'd met him in a pub, you would have had a fantastic evening with him, just listening to him, telling you stories and singing you songs. And I think that's another great way to think of him.
Absolutely. And I think alongside that scholarly work, you know, you've got the work of, not the work, the pleasure of people living within Ettrick who have done a great deal to keep Hogg's memory alive through the exhibition in Ettrick. I'm thinking of people like Vicky Davidson of the Ettrick and Yarrow Community Development Association, families like the Mitchells at Henderland, who through several generations now have done their utmost to keep Hogg's memory alive. And maybe that's the great legacy of his writing, is that he not only gave his ballads and gave his work to the scholars and to everyone who loves writing, but he also celebrated the community, and they have paid that debt back by keeping his memory alive there.
Yeah, it's great. He straddles the sort of the local and the international in that way, which is not to say that Scott doesn't do that, but you know, Scott was of a different order. I mean, you know, Scott was so famous and so successful in his own lifetime, and went on being, you know, such a huge internationally known and read writer for all of the 19th and quite a bit of the 20th century. So they kind of made their imprint or impact upon the world in different ways. But you get a sense that in a weird kind of way, Hogg's a little bit like the tortoise and the hare. You know, he's coming up behind, and you know, he's maybe his reputation is going to last perhaps a bit longer than Scott. Who knows? But I don't think you can necessarily separate them out. I think they are both two writers from one period, and it's not possible to really understand that period without looking at both of them and others at the same time.
Absolutely. And with that in mind, we thought that we would end by reading a couple of our favourite bits of Scott and Hogg. And James, I think you should go first.
Okay, well, I'm going to read a wee bit from Hogg first, I think, and he wrote a wonderful, lots of supernatural stories in that Hogg wrote, with a supernatural element to them. And he wrote a story called The Brownie of the Black Hags, which is quite easy to find. If you haven't read it, I would recommend it. It's not very long, but it's absolutely fascinating. It's full of macabrous goings on, and there's a supernatural element to it and mystery going on in it. And just at the end, I'm just going to read the last paragraph, which doesn't really spoil the story at all. But it's to me, it's a great example of some of the ways that Hogg got across a traditional story, but actually retold it or told it as a printed literary artifact as well. So at the end of The Brownie of the Black Hags, which the central two figures are two people who are interlinked by fate and by murder as well, actually, and they can't separate out, they can't leave each other alone, but they actually loathe each other. And this is how Hogg finishes the story. This story was told to me by an old man named Adam Halliday, whose great-grandfather, Thomas Halliday, was one of those that found the body and buried it. It is many years since I heard it, but however ridiculous it may appear, I remember it made a dreadful impression on my young mind. I never heard any story like it, save one of an old foxhound that pursued a fox through the Grampians for a fortnight, and when at last discovered by the Duke of Athol's people, neither of them could run, but the hound was still continuing to walk after the fox. And when the latter lay down, the other lay down beside him and looked at him steadily all the while, though unable to do him the least harm. The passion of inveterate malice seems to have influenced these two exactly alike. And then here's the kicker at the end. But upon the whole, I scarcely believe the tale can be true. So having told you the story and then said that he first heard it from his an old man, and then he had heard it from his great-great-grandfather and so on, and then he throws in little references to the Duke of Athol's men. So he seems to be saying that there's a lot of truth behind the story, and then he undermines it at the last and it says, but you know what, I think it must be made up. And yet he's printed it in a book, and I love that. That's classic Hogg for me. And then my just very, very briefly, one of my favourite Walter Scott novels is The Heart of Midlothian, wonderful, big, epic novel set in 1736. And one of the characters there is the Laird of Dumby Dykes, Jock Dumby, who succeeds his father as Laird at the age of 15, when Scott describes him as a tall, gawky, silly-looking boy. And he's enamoured of Jeannie Deans, the heroine of the novel. And at one point, she's his tenant. And at one point, he actually offers her to marry her, but she rejects him. And but he's very decent and kind-hearted kind of guy. And later, he marries the Laird of Lickpelt's daughter. And the reason he gives is she sits next to us in the kirk, and that's the way I came to think on it. So he's a kind of simple-minded soul, but his heart is in the right place. But the bit I love, and it's a beautiful piece of just almost a throwaway thing from Walter Scott, when Jock's father, the old Laird of Dumby Dykes, is dying. On his deathbed, he says to him, "Jock, when you hae nothing else to do, you may be aye sticking in a tree. It'll be growing, Jock, when you're sleeping." And I love that because it's very ecologically sound. We should be planting lots of trees. Scott himself was a great planter of trees, planted thousands and thousands of trees around Abbotsford. But it's also just so beautifully said in Scots, and it reminds us that the gentry in that time, the early part of the 18th century, they all still spoke Scots. So there's loads of great bits in The Heart of Midlothian, but that's one of my favourites.
They're both absolutely cracking extracts, and I think give a real flavour of why these writers are still being remembered 250 years on.
What are yours?
The ones I chose myself are poetry. And again, to emphasise the point that both these writers are known as novelists, but they're fantastic poets as well. And the Scott one that I really like is from The Lay of the Last Minstrel, published in 1805, which really takes us back to the sort of romanticised source singers of the ballads, with a little Ossianic twist. So I just love the first bit, so I'll just read that. The way was long, the wind was cold, the minstrel was infirm and old. His withered cheek and tresses grey seemed to have known a better day. The harp, his sole remaining joy, was carried by an orphan boy. The last of all the bards was he who sang of border chivalry. For well a day their date was fled, his tuneful brethren all were dead. And he, neglected and oppressed, wished to be with them and at rest. And I absolutely love that because it's partly tongue-in-cheek and it's meant to be slightly funny, you know. And there's a lovely, my copy of it is from the 1830 reprint, and in which Scott says, quite frankly, it would be great affectation not to own that the author expected some success from The Lay of the Last Minstrel. He's cashing in on the minstrelsy. So I love that. Again, it's Scott. There's a lot of humour in Scott, and I don't think people always think of him as a funny writer, but I think he's hilarious.
He is very funny, and I think that you're right there. It's also easy to forget that these great epic romances that he wrote, these great long poems he wrote, very often his tongue is very firmly in his cheek. Yeah.
Absolutely. As indeed is Hogg's in the one that I really love. I love the Queen's Wake, and I'm fortunate enough to have an early edition of that, which is falling apart. So I'll try not to drop bits of it whilst I'm reading. But I think one of the bits of poetry that actually other people have loved by Hogg. And I know Muriel Spark really liked this poem. She mentions it in The Crime of Miss Jane Brodie. It's the 13th Bard's Song from the Queen's Wake, Hogg's best-selling breakthrough book of 1813, which is a collection of poems supposedly written in a competition for a harp by a selection of bards from the hands of Mary, Queen of Scots. And this is, as I say, one of the ones that was very popular in the 19th and early 20th century. Kilmeny, the 13th Bard's Song. Bonnie Kilmeny gaed up the glen, but it wasna to meet Dunera's men, nor the rosy monk of the isle to see, for Kilmeny was pure as pure could be. It was only to hear the yorlin sing and poo the cressflower round the spring, the scarlet hip and the hindberry, and the nut that hang from the hazel tree, for Kilmeny was pure as pure could be. But lang may her minnie look o'er the wa. Wonderful ballad line, that's straight from the Bonnie Earl of Murray.
Yes.
Lang may she seek in the greenwood shaw, lang the laird of Dunera blame, and lang greet her Kilmeny come hame. When many a day had come and fled, when grief grew calm and hope was dead, when mass for Kilmeny's soul had been sung, when the beadsman had prayed and the dead bell rung, late in a gloamin' when all was still, when the fringe was red on the westland hill, the wood was sere, the moon in the wane, the reek of the cot hung over the plain, like a little wee cloud in the world that's lain, when the ingle loud with an eerie lean, late in the gloamin', Kilmeny came hame. And I just love that, because as the poem goes on, you don't know if Kilmeny was dead. She's been gone for 7 years. You don't know if she was taken away by the fairies. You don't know if she was bewitched. And you don't know if she just decided to go on a sort of muse-like journey, because in the end, she ends up going back to the land of thought. And that, to me, again, is Hogg at his poetic best.
Absolutely right. Very good.